Joining us, we have Vanessa Inadomi, Senior Technical Product Manager at AWS, Phillip Miller, VP of Product Management, Chaos, Nathan Robinson, Founder and COO, Ntropic, and Co-Founder at NIM Labs, Andrew Sinagra, Creative Director, Ntropic, and Co-Founder at NIM Labs. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Round of applause for our speakers. And without further ado, building the creative pipeline of the future.
Hello, everyone can hear me? Hi, everyone. I'm Vanessa Inadomi, as been introduced. I am a product manager on AWS Deadline Cloud, which is a new service launched just a couple of weeks ago. It's a fully managed service that helps keep and simplify the render management process. Today I'm here to talk with my guests, and they were also just introduced. I'm really excited about that, to tell us in their own words how they're looking at their businesses today, how cloud computing and cloud rendering specifically has been able to transform their business and how they're able to respond to that. And so in their own words, they're going to tell us our story. One thing I don't have today with me is a ton of time, so I'm going to try to jump right into the questions right away. If you need to do any further introductions or tell your own stories, feel free to do that when you answer the questions, but I'll jump right in. So I'll start with you, Andrew. One thing in previous discussions we talked a lot about this challenge that you said, the throughput challenge you had. How basically, maybe you could describe that to me, what you saw there, how you're able to respond, and what were you using today, and maybe what are you continuing to do today with addressing that challenge?
Right. Well, one of the biggest issues that we saw when, with rendering and on-prem solutions is a lot of times you're fighting for priority on the farm, right? You're limited by what your throughput is on the job. If you're running multiple jobs, you're limited with capacity, so you're trying to juggle those deadlines back and forth, no pun intended. And then you also have producers basically arguing for who can get their shots out first, what postings are trying to happen. And when you're moving to a cloud model, you can essentially spin up your own individual farm per job. And at that point, it's exponential on your growth, right? There's no limitation to what you could do. No one's stepping on one another. So essentially, there's no priorities. You're basically just creating dedicated farms for each individual project that you're working on.
That's great. Any of you have any additional comments to add to that with throughput challenging?
I mean, definitely throughput is always an issue. I mean, we're always coming up against, clients giving us last minute changes. Hey, we need this by tomorrow. The frame rates, the resolutions we're having to work at. So being able to augment our on-prem solution with the cloud has been a huge, huge thing for us.
So having these sort of infinite resources available to you from the computing side, how does that translate into your staff and your artists? And how are you, maybe Nate, I know you talked about this before, of trying to implement this, follow the sun method and truly be able to implement that across your staff and having artists work in a 24/7 sort of operating model. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think, definitely going into the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, we've all adopted this, work from home, work from anywhere, hybrid solution. And so, we kind of for us, we do have some on-prem stuff. We use HP Anywhere to log into a lot of computers, but there's definitely still a throughput bottleneck that kind of happens. And, most recently we were working on this project, for the Sphere in Vegas, actually, ironically enough, and, got a bunch of client notes in, we're working at 16K, 90-second piece, 60 frames per second. And we had to deliver on a Monday, it's a Sunday night. We get all these changes. And it's amazing to be able to spin up a cloud instance, being able to augment that farm. We had our on-prem solution rendering one section. We had the cloud rendering another, and we were able to deliver. And so, I really think, as we move forward in business, the name of the game right now is agility. I mean, that really is the key to business right now, especially in M&E and visual effects. And, so that ability to be able to hey, I don't have to go rent another 300 nodes. I can just spin up 300 nodes. Don't have to worry about the cooling, the power requirements. These are all huge things that have really, as we've been running Ntropic, now for 27 years, it's these are the things you have to deal with, all these capital investments. And so being able to operate at this very large scale, by basically just, spinning up something so easy to do now. Back in the old days, it was a little bit, you needed more of an IT team. Now it's really simple. Just a couple things, upload your scene, render, got the files back, super easy.
That's great. Phillip, happy birthday, by the way.
Happy birthday to you.
Excellent. Chaos is one of those that also artists across the globe are utilizing today and cross-collaborating. How, for your services and what you've seen or what artists are coming to you or customers are coming to you for, Where's cloud computing fitting in for you, and where have you been able to kind of transform their pipelines by building on top of those services?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's evolved. I mean, to begin with, we all had to concentrate on just making the most production-worthy solution that was highly scalable. And I believe we did that. V-Ray's pretty popular. I kind of heard about that. Yeah. But most of that was on-prem, and even then we relied on other companies for the queue management. We chose to concentrate purely on the rendering, and so solutions like Deadline, even the original, were critical to our overall solution. So we made sure that we worked with the queue managers and everything. When the pandemic hit and everything, one of the biggest things that we had to make sure worked really well was actually licensing, being able to flexibly suddenly have your licenses available anywhere, use them, access them. It sounds trivial, but it didn't work for a lot of applications. Luckily, ours did. And then as people started working more remotely and separately, exchanging files, exchanging projects, having to share resources became more and more important. So that it's actually the overall workflow that we've been trying to access the most, or I should say, help out the most, besides improving the overall rendering solutions. And bursting to the cloud is one of those real important things that people need to do, because again, if you don't have it on-prem, then it doesn't really matter where it's going to be unless it's a cost situation. But as solutions become more affordable, it's always faster if you could divide by 100. And one of the things about scalability is if it is highly scalable, and that's one of the things we do with our software, then it's like kind of what I call cloud magic, in the sense that it doesn't cost more to go faster. And so that's one of the things that we concentrate on.
And in terms of, I think, one ways that we've collaborated together and using Graviton instances, that's something that you've heard from your customers as being important in terms of, performance, sustainability, how that's measured and how that's captured. Graviton instances can do some of that for our customers. It sounds like that was something you were able to collaborate with us on. And
Oh, absolutely. So the number one question we always get about cloud rendering is cost. What can we do to make it more affordable? Well, using ARM processors is one of those things that we could do. So we were really excited when Amazon was coming out with your new Graviton processors, because they're not just high performance, but they're also, because they're using less electricity, they're more affordable. And so all the tests that we're showing right now is that comparable speed, it's always cheaper. And we hope to be having that solution available for people to use with V-Ray later this summer.
I'm glad you mentioned cost, because that was something that we know that our customers are very, very interested and excited about. It's a very different approach, I think, and I'm curious from any of you how you've been able to kind of take a look at maybe what you considered in the past of taking, say, cloud computing or rendering in specific, a fixed resource, right, that you're sort of capitalizing on. Now this is becoming a more pay-as-you-go, pay-as-you-need-it. It's a more of a variable resource for you, or a variable expense. And so what was that transition like, or how, what were the challenges that you faced there, and maybe how did you overcome that, or where are you kind of taking that forward?
Yeah, I mean, I could take that. One of the things when you're building an on-prem farm is you're always building to the most expensive, computationally expensive solution, right? So we have to cover everything from, complex V-Ray renders that may take a very long time to simple new composites, right? But we're running all of them on the same machines because we're always trying to maximize that bandwidth on-prem. Well, when you actually move to a farm solution, Deadline Cloud, you can actually build out fleets that are right-sized to your job. And not only to your jobs, for the specific subset of tasks that you're doing. So you could have multiple fleets on the same job, actually have more computationally complex ones for your simulations and things like that, and then also have simpler fleets set up for your 2D rendering. So really being able to be really intelligent about how you build out and scale and set up your fleets, I think is something that, in the past we haven't had to do, but you're going to be able to be more accurate with your budgeting and predictions for what you're going to actually use and spend throughout the rendering project.
And I'm curious how then that's translated over to, say, clients. When you're, projecting out costs for a project, do you use those measurements and project that over to your clients? How does that work?
since I have to deal with procurement all the time on the business, I can get that one. But yeah, I mean, let's be honest. I think our industry for so long, I mean, back when Flame first came out, we have this loaded rate. Like our business has so much been about loaded rates that include an artist, a machine, energy, overhead, but it's always been hard to somewhat quantify. Now with this, it's great. It's like, here's a report. Hey, client, here's what this costs to do. You want to make new revisions. You want to like change it. This is the cost. So I really see an interesting model of how we're starting to use it. And, granted, bigger feature film studios have been able to do it, but it's still a little bit kind of a black box kind of thing. Now we're going to actually have like, here's the proof. And I think, being able to charge this on a cost plus basis now of like, hey, we're going to put an allocation of X amount of money, but, here's what it costs. And that way the client can be very aware and we can pass that off to them, because as we have to bring down rates and things to, hit, margins and stuff like that, now we can actually give them, hey, you're going to pay for the rendering. You're going to pay for this stuff now. So I think it actually will help us a lot.
Yeah, in some ways that additional transparency to the client actually allows us to recoup some of that money because as Nate mentioned, working with blended rates and just kind of having this like blanket cost for CG, it's like, well, the client didn't really know what was happening under the hood and they're just trying to cut out hours. But at this way, we can actually say, no, this shot took this amount of hours and we're going to have that hard data coming back out of Deadline Cloud and being able to pass that directly back to the clients.
That's great. One thing you mentioned, Nate, that reminded me, I'm going to maybe take a step back. You talked about being agile, and this is maybe one response to that is being able to kind of respond to any changes in a client ask and say, yep, that's great. I can change over and respond to that. But talk about, say, even just changes in software or hardware. We're seeing the pace of that change and the rate of that change increase over and over and over again. Tell me how maybe cloud computing is helping in that area as well.
Well, definitely. I mean, when I think back to the first time I bought 5 Supermicro blades, it was like dropped like $550,000 on these, pieces of, hardware that lasted maybe, I got, good 2 years, 3 years out of them. Now the rate of graphics cards changing, CPUs, all this stuff, it doesn't make sense. I mean, I used to like have this kind of thing where I was like, oh, I'm going to do a 3-year lease. I'll amortize that over 3 years. Okay, now I'll buy the next great generation. The truth of the matter is stuff gets outdated so quickly now. So actually having the ability, to Andrew's point earlier, let's spin up the fastest CPU when we need that. If we need a more GPU solution, we're going to spin up the fastest GPUs. And then we can also, based on how much time we have in a schedule, like, okay, maybe we can take the slower version and not have it cost as much. So really, when I look at that from just a business standpoint, that's me putting on my business hat, not the creative hat. I mean, it makes a lot of sense now. It's very hard for me to justify why would I go out and drop all this money on hardware that will be obsolete in 6 months.
One last question I wanted to ask each of you, so I'll give each of you time to ask, or answer that question. As audience here is listening, and even as I'm hearing you, I'm very convinced, right? I think this is a new, exciting way to kind of operate. What would you give your advice, or what advice would you give to somebody who is trying to think or reimagine? What are some of the things that they need to do? Either is it cultural change in their organizations, it's skills they need to build? What is that advice that you would give to somebody who's trying to rethink their pipeline today?
I mean, first off, typically in the past, as we mentioned, we always use blended rates for everything, right? So having that transparency start at the bidding process and educating producers on what it's going to take to render projects and getting more involved in, again, right-sizing the farm and right-sizing those predictions, I think you're going to start to see integrations with something like NIM, with our project management software, where you're going to be able to capture that actualization information from the render farm back onto the jobs. And because in NIM we have the bids and we have that render analysis and the actual cost expense there, we're going to be able to help you predict what it's going to cost to render the next bid that would be similar to one you've done in the past. So I think there's going to be this kind of loop that helps you actually, the initial process is good. There's going to be some learning, right? People are going to have to understand what size instances are and how fast they go and those types of things. But once you get past that initial hurdle, I think what we're going to see is you're going to have this feedback loop of understanding, well, for this type of bid, this is the types of fleets we need to set up, and you're going to end up with those reoccurring projects with a better understanding of what your expenses are going to be.
I love that. And I think as we go along, what I find great already is that these things can change too as you learn and grow and see something. And that is so immediate and transparent to you right away to say, oh, well, that job was running really long. Oh, I used a different fleet type. Let me change that and do it again or try it again. And those things are really great to see that iterative process be so real time.
Yeah. And also the fact that it's dynamic. I mean, if something's going slower, or all of a sudden the client said, "Hey, I need this today," spin up a faster machine right now. I mean, just add that fleet. So, it's all fluid, and it's just there's gonna be an obvious learning process, because right now people just, when it's on-prem, they just assume it's free, So, but once you get past that initial hurdle, I think it's actually, you're gonna be much more agile through the course of the project.
Nate, what advice would you give?
I thought I got to ask you a question. Well, I mean, to answer it a little bit differently. So I remember like when I first opened up Ntropic, I never wanted technology to be a bottleneck. Like that's a big part of our ethos, right? It's like we always just want to let the artist create, never be bottlenecked by technology. And so it's funny, like when you think back, early on when the Flame first came out, or even before that, big like online edit suites, people used to book rooms or go to a studio because it's like, oh, you had this piece of hardware. What this is going to allow now is definitely a democratization where you can get 4 artists that are super talented who maybe you wouldn't have gone to them because you're like, ooh, can they actually handle the job? Do they have the horsepower? Now they have however many nodes they want to get it done. So they're not going to be bottlenecked. It's going to be a really great thing for all these new studios, these new creative minds that actually, haven't had the opportunity because they couldn't invest $2 million up front. So not having to put that capital in, and it obviously is very personal to me because, I remember I refinanced my loft when I started Ntropic, pulled out money, like that's what I used to buy like my first Flame. And so it's like, it's really cool now to just be like, hey, from day one, I could start a studio, I could spin stuff up and be able to compete at a big level against the bigger studios with a much smaller team. And that kind of ties back to that agility thing, so.
Yeah, we've even seen that now today. It's been amazing to see even just an artist go in and try it out themselves, go in and create a farm and create their own environment just to test it out and be able to have that ability to know and understand and grow and learn on your own as a single artist can be huge and amazing for others. Phillip, what would you?
Well, I would say don't be afraid of it. First of all, don't be afraid of it from a security standpoint. I think those days are over. Everyone is very comfortable with it, whether it's the customer or the client. But more importantly, don't be afraid of it from it being hard to do. You guys have made it a lot easier. Otherwise, you had to have dedicated people that's all they did was manage this sort of pipeline. Now it's really coming down to where a standard TD can do it just fine. And that really makes it much, much more approachable.
That's a really great point about security. I think that's something that we've obviously worked really, really, really hard to make sure that is top of mind for our customers and that we keep that secure. But to give that, give that up is a challenge, but still something that you can feel pretty confident in, I think.
Oh, it's been vetted so many times in so many ways. Both by, analysis, but also just through usage. It just proves that it's extremely secure.
Well, I think that's all the questions I had for our panelists today. Do you want to give them a round of applause? Are there questions that the audience maybe has for our panelists? I think there's a question.
See how loud it is. Okay. Phillip, you touched on it at the end there, but I'm curious, internally for you guys, once this all started rolling out, I know, Vanessa, you mentioned that it's easy for artists to jump in there and, cue something, but, when there's a lot more people involved and, comps are being sent back and forth and, there's multiple artists on the same shots, for you guys, how have you delegated and trained and sort of like rolled this process out, across all these different artists? Do you have someone internally, sort of running these jobs for people, or do you kind of leave it to artists to, just run with it and get done with what they need to?
As far as like the management of the render farm, it's essentially the same as running on-prem. You still have the same, it's a very similar interface to like Deadline 10. You're managing jobs. There's still priorities. The main difference is that you can actually set up segmented queues and fleets, and then you can allocate, say, certain people or certain jobs to certain queues. You can give people different priorities. So, from a management standpoint and setting it up, it's actually incredibly easy to get going. I think in the past when we originally were approached with this, I thought it was actually like, oh, I set up auto scaling and I had to manage the instances. It's none of that actually. It's all handled. There's an initial kind of walkthrough to do to set up the environment. But once the environment's set up, it's a couple button clicks to set up a fleet. I mean, and honestly, like once, like it doesn't even have to be creatives or TDs doing it. You could actually have producers doing it once they understand, about what they are scaling up, right? So it's incredibly easy to manage. But then, yeah, from a production standpoint, it's really no different than any on-prem solution. And then as far as moving assets around, all the assets are cached up in the cloud. So if somebody else has already uploaded assets, another artist isn't going to re-upload that asset. The submitter actually recognizes that the assets are already stored there, and you're only uploading whatever isn't already cached.
Yeah, we've really tried to also make permission handling as simple as possible as well. So hopefully that's also easy enough to just at the start, be able to segment and classify and be able to provide the right people the right permissions. And then as you go along, you can make those more advanced as you want to kind of increase and expand that as you go along.
Yeah, and you can also set up budgets per queue or fleet.
Per queue.
Per queue. And so you can actually dedicate certain people to certain queues, so like certain teams or certain artists aren't going to go over a certain budget as well. And you can set up flags and warnings, so as you're approaching the end of your budget, it'll give you a warning, or you could tell it to just stop rendering right away the second you hit your budget.
Great question. Any other questions from the audience?
Since I'm Felix, I'm involved with Deadline Cloud somehow, so I'm going to ask a different question. Since we're talking about building the creative pipeline of the future, what are your thoughts on integrating AI or AI capabilities in those workflows? And any of you?
I can start on that one. Yeah. I mean, for me, I typically go straight to, again, NIM with our project management software, and actually looking at taking the bid and then looking at the analytics from the actual renders that we're doing, including those, kicking that information back as expense reports inside and getting the job actualizations, and then using AI to help predictably bid jobs more accurately over the course of, a company's lifespan. So, we're maintaining all that historical information about all of your projects, from bids through projection through actualizations. So this is just one more piece of information that we can pinpoint. How much did this shot cost? How much did this artist cost you? We could rate artists on how many bad renders they submit, those types of things. But you can feed all that information into an AI engine that can actually give you much better predictive models for when you're bidding your next project. So that's immediately where I go to.
From a software solution standpoint, at CATS, we're developing numerous things that do leverage AI. And we're finding that the cloud is actually the perfect environment to be holding those in for various reasons. You want to be running it there. The models really take the neural nets, that is, and the processing also coming back on it. But in general, I mean, at the very simplest, it's like denoising. But when it gets to generative AI, when you actually start modifying the pixels and change, we want to be very, very careful to give the artists the control over it. We want to give them a better brush. We don't want to take them away. So we're building a lot of that control into our software now. You'll be seeing it coming out, maybe even later this year. But it will have a cloud component in the sense that it'll probably be hooking in to be part of that workflow.
I think you know a thing or two about modifying pixels.
Yeah. Polishing them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent question. Any other questions from the group? Okay, one last round of applause for our fabulous panel. Thank you.
Guys.